What do you do when 3 of your own warships get hit with missiles, drones, and speedboats at the exact same moment, in a sea lane only a few miles wide, during a ceasefire that was supposed to have already ended the war? Before we get into what actually happened out there, hit that like button right now, tap subscribe, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is over because it isn't. And what you're about to hear proves it. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to go back to the last week of February 2026. That's when the United States and Israel launched a joint campaign against Iran, a campaign built to cripple Iran's missile program, its nuclear sites, and its top military leadership in one sudden blow. Within the first day, Iran's leadership had been hit hard. Military bases, missile factories, command centers, all targeted in a fast, coordinated assault. Iran did not sit back and absorb it quietly. It fired back at Israel and at American bases scattered across the Gulf region, from Bahrain to Qatar to the UAE. And then it did something that reached far beyond the battlefield. It shut down the Strait of Hormuz. If you have never heard of this stretch of water, here is why it matters so much. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil moves through this one narrow channel every single day, along with a similar share of the world's shipped natural gas. At its tightest point, it is barely 20 miles across, and the actual lanes ships must use to pass safely are only a couple of miles wide each. Every tanker, every container ship funnels through this one corridor, hugging close enough to Iranian shores that shore batteries, patrol boats, and missile launchers can reach them without traveling far from home. This is what makes the entire situation so dangerous. A defending warship moving through here isn't out in open ocean where it can maneuver freely and keep threats at a safe distance. It's threading a needle within sight of the very coastline Iran has spent decades building its entire naval strategy around exploiting. When Iran announced the strait was closed, it wasn't a threat on paper. The Iranian Navy broadcast warnings over open radio channels telling every ship in the area that passage would not be allowed. Ships turned around. Many simply stayed in port rather than risk the crossing at all. Insurance costs spiked, oil markets shook, and an economic nerve that touches nearly every country on Earth suddenly went numb. By the middle of April, both sides agreed to stop the fighting. A ceasefire took hold. But peace on a document and peace on the water are two very different things. Around 2,000 ships sat stranded in the Gulf, along with thousands of sailors who had nowhere to go. So the United States launched a new mission, one built specifically to walk commercial ships safely through that narrow, dangerous corridor, escorted by American warships the entire way. That mission is where our story actually begins, because escorting ships through water Iran had vowed to keep closed was never going to stay peaceful for long. The first crack in that fragile peace came in early May. Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small attack boats at commercial vessels and at American ships moving through the strait. American helicopters responded fast, sinking half a dozen small Iranian boats within hours. Iranian state media claimed a U.S. destroyer had been struck. The American military said plainly that nothing of the sort happened. No ship was hit. That gap between what Iran's own media claimed and what the American military actually confirmed is something you should keep in the back of your mind, because it comes up again and again in this story. Before we get to that day, it helps to understand exactly what Iran was actually trying to accomplish, because none of what came next was improvised on the spot. The Iranian Navy had spent years running drills built entirely around this exact scenario, exercises with names most people outside the region have never heard of, all designed to simulate a mass wave of small boats and missiles, overwhelming a technologically superior opponent through sheer numbers rather than raw firepower. Every rehearsal was aimed at the same basic idea: force a defending ship to split its limited supply of interceptors across dozens of separate threats arriving at once, hoping that somewhere in that chaos, something gets through. 3 days later, on May 7th, something far bigger happened. 3 American destroyers, the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, were moving through the strait toward the Gulf of Oman as part of that same escort mission. According to the American military's own statement, Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small boats at all 3 ships at the very same time. Not one weapon after another, all of it, together, aimed at 3 separate warships moving as one formation. Picture what that actually takes to pull off. Someone has to track 3 moving targets. Someone has to line up missile crews, drone operators, and boat squadrons so that everything arrives at nearly the same instant instead of one thing at a time that could be picked off easily. That kind of timing does not happen by accident. It takes real coordination, real command structure, and real intent. Stop and actually sit with that for a second. This wasn't a lone missile fired from a distant battery hoping to get lucky. This was air, sea, and surface threats converging on 3 moving targets at once, the exact kind of scenario Iran had rehearsed for years specifically to overwhelm a stronger navy through sheer volume rather than raw firepower. And every single part of that attack failed. Not one American ship was hit. The U.S. military's own statement said it plainly. Forces intercepted the attacks and struck back in self-defense. Within hours, American aircraft and missiles hit the sites responsible, the launch positions, the command centers, the surveillance posts that had made the coordinated attack possible in the first place. Some of those strikes reached deep into Iranian territory, stretching from the southern coastline toward the capital itself. Think about why that response went so far beyond the original attack site. If you only hit the exact spot a missile came from, the network behind it, the people tracking your ships, coordinating timing, and relaying orders stays intact and ready to try again. Hitting the command and surveillance nodes instead is a message aimed at the whole system, not just the trigger. It says, we're not just answering this attack, we're trying to make sure you can't organize another one like it. It's worth naming the ships themselves because each one brings something slightly different to a moment like this. The Mason had already seen this kind of fight before, having helped intercept missile threats in the Red Sea during earlier regional flare-ups, making its crew some of the most combat-tested sailors in the current fleet when it comes to shooting down missiles and drones under real pressure. The Truxtun and the Rafael Peralta run the exact same radar and interceptor architecture, which meant the three ships together weren't just three separate targets. They were one overlapping shield, each one covering gaps the others might have missed. Now here's the part that should genuinely impress you, whichever side of this conflict you find yourself sympathizing with. Three ships, one coordinated wave of missiles, drones, and boats, a tactic built from the ground up to overwhelm a defender by throwing more at them than they can possibly track. And the result was 0 hits. 0. These destroyers run on the Aegis Combat System, a network of radar and interceptors built for exactly this kind of moment, tracking dozens of threats at once and deciding in real time which one needs to die first. Picture it like layers wrapped around each ship. Long-range interceptors reach out and destroy threats while they're still far away. If something slips past that layer, rapid-fire cannons mounted on deck are built to shred anything that gets close in the final seconds. Electronic systems run quietly the whole time, trying to scramble the guidance on incoming missiles and drones so they simply lose track of their target. And for the small boats skimming across the water, the ship's own guns and helicopters handle that threat separately. 3 ships, each running every one of these layers, covering each other's blind spots. That overlapping coverage is exactly why a strike built to overwhelm one ship's defenses couldn't get through 3 of them working together. If you're finding this useful, drop a comment telling me which part surprised you the most, because the story gets even bigger from here, and I want to know your take before we get to the ending. To really understand why Iran fought this way, you have to go back nearly 40 years to 1988, when American and Iranian forces clashed directly during the Iran-Iraq War. That confrontation, still the largest one-day naval battle the U.S. Navy had fought since World War II at that point, ended with roughly half of Iran's operational fleet sunk or crippled in a single day. Iran never forgot that lesson. Instead of trying to rebuild a navy that could stand toe-to-toe with American warships, it went the opposite direction, investing in huge numbers of cheap, fast, small boats, backed by shore missiles and drones, built to swarm rather than to fight ship to ship. What happened on May 7th wasn't Iran improvising. It was a doctrine nearly 4 decades in the making, tested for the first time against real American warships in an actual conflict, not a training drill. Iran's arsenal for this kind of fight is genuinely layered. Short-range anti-ship missiles mounted on small, fast boats can strike targets 30 or so miles away. Behind those sit longer-range sea-skimming missiles capable of reaching out past a couple hundred miles, letting land-based batteries threaten ships without ever leaving the coastline. Add explosive drones and speedboats capable of racing across the water at well over 60 miles an hour, and you get a genuinely difficult puzzle. Missiles, drones, and boats, each moving differently, each showing up on radar differently, all arriving close enough together that a defending crew has only seconds to sort out what matters most. The very next day, the United States pushed further, striking 2 Iranian tankers that were trying to slip back toward Iranian ports in defiance of the naval blockade that had been running since mid-April. Rather than hitting the hull or the cargo, American jets targeted the smokestacks, a deliberate choice designed to knock out propulsion and stop the ship cold without triggering an environmental disaster from a punctured cargo hold. Weeks later, another tanker ignored repeated warnings and was hit with cannon fire for the same reason, following a nearly identical incident involving a different Iranian-flagged vessel just weeks before that. The blockade never actually paused through any of this. It just kept running quietly underneath every headline grabbing missile exchange, a steady, almost routine enforcement effort that got far less attention than the dramatic destroyer engagement, but arguably shaped the economics of this entire standoff just as much. It also helps to remember that this confrontation never happened in isolation. American destroyers weren't the only ones defending against Iranian missiles and drones that spring. Gulf partners, including the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, were running their own missile defense operations at the very same time, often sharing radar tracking and threat data directly with American commanders. A moment like May 7th in that sense was really one single node inside a much larger regional shield, a whole network of allied systems working together to stop an overlapping wave of Iranian weapons being thrown at multiple countries at once, not at any single ship. That coalition side of the story is easy to lose when the headlines narrow down to 3 American ship names, but it's a big part of why the response that day was as fast and as coordinated as it was. Zoom out for a second and look at what all of this meant for the rest of the world. With the strait effectively choked off for months and thousands of ships stuck waiting, oil markets swung wildly, spiking every time news broke of another clash, easing slightly whenever ceasefire talks looked promising. A handful of small boats and a few interceptor missiles fired in a narrow stretch of water were, in a very real sense, shaping what people paying at the gas pump on the other side of the planet were seeing on the price display, whether they ever heard about this exact naval clash or not. And underneath all of it sat real human cost, mostly carried by people who never signed up for a war. Thousands of civilian sailors sat trapped in the Gulf for weeks, caught between a closed strait, an active blockade, and sudden bursts of missile fire. A container ship belonging to a major French shipping company was actually struck while crossing the strait, injuring crew members who had nothing to do with any of this, beyond simply doing their jobs. To grasp just how much pressure the entire region's air defenses were under, look beyond the strait itself. The United Arab Emirates alone reported shooting down over 500 ballistic missiles, more than 2,000 drones, and dozens of cruise missiles across this conflict. Kuwait's own numbers put its intercepts near 100 ballistic missiles and hundreds of drones, all while protecting a base holding more than 13,000 American troops. The May 7th attack on those 3 destroyers wasn't some isolated flashpoint. It was one moment inside a much bigger, much longer pattern of missiles and drones being thrown across the entire region, week after week, all spring long. Here is what makes this whole moment even stranger. While missiles were flying and tankers were being disabled, American diplomats were at the very same time working to extend the ceasefire by 60 more days, trying to lock in a full stop to hostilities and get Iran to give up its nuclear program entirely. Negotiators talking peace in one room while ships exchanged fire in the water outside is not some rare contradiction. It's actually a fairly normal feature of how modern ceasefires work in practice. Each side keeps applying just enough pressure to strengthen its position at the table without fully collapsing the talks themselves. It helps to picture the mindset in each capital during those weeks. In Tehran, every strike that failed to sink an American ship was still, in a strange way, useful, proof to its own population and to the region that it hadn't simply surrendered to American pressure after Operation Epic Fury. In Washington, every attack that was defeated cleanly became its own kind of proof too, that the huge investment in ships, radar, and interceptors was paying off exactly when it mattered most. 2 very different definitions of victory, playing out in the same stretch of water, sometimes on the very same afternoon. Think about what each side was really trying to prove through all of this. Iran, still boxed in by a blockade cutting off its ports, had every reason to keep showing it could still cause real damage and real risk, even under a supposed ceasefire, just to strengthen its hand in whatever comes next at the negotiating table. The United States, for its part, had every reason to prove that any attempt to challenge American naval operations would be crushed immediately and decisively, sending a clear message that resistance carries cost without delivering any actual victory. There's a genuine debate worth having about what a moment like May 7th actually proves. Some look at 3 ships defeating a fully coordinated attack with 0 damage and see clear proof that American naval defenses have finally solved the problem Iran spent decades trying to create, an unbeatable answer to swarm tactics. Others aren't so sure. They point out that surviving one big coordinated attack doesn't guarantee survival against something even larger, more missiles, more boats, more drones, launched from more directions, against a smaller group of ships with less overlapping coverage than 3 destroyers moving together. There's also a quieter argument worth sitting with. Every interceptor missile fired to stop an incoming threat is expensive, and every ship can only carry so many before it needs to sail home and reload. If Iran's real goal isn't sinking a destroyer outright, but instead forcing American ships to burn through their limited supply of interceptors again and again, then even a string of total defeats for Iran could still function as a slow, grinding war of attrition, so long as Iran can rebuild its own boats and batteries faster than America can restock its magazines. Whether that math actually favors Iran over the long run is exactly the kind of question naval planners on both sides are almost certainly running behind closed doors every single time one of these clashes happens. It's worth remembering that President Trump himself weighed in publicly right after the strikes, describing the confrontation in far more dramatic terms than the careful, measured language CENTCOM used, claiming the attacking Iranian forces had been completely wiped out. That contrast alone tells you something about how the same event can be described in wildly different ways depending on who's doing the talking, official military statements built on caution, and political statements built for headlines. This confrontation didn't stay confined to military briefings either. It landed directly in political debates back home almost immediately, with some lawmakers pointing to it as proof that Iran remains dangerous even under a signed ceasefire, using it to argue for keeping American forces in the region rather than pulling back. An attack that ends in 0 American casualties and a flawless defense still tends to get read as evidence the threat hasn't gone away, rather than evidence the ceasefire is actually holding, and which of those readings you believe probably says more about your own priors than about the attack itself. This wasn't the last time that exact cycle played out either. About 3 weeks after the destroyer attack, the American military again announced self-defense strikes in southern Iran, this time hitting 2 Iranian boats caught in the act of laying mines in the strait, along with an air defense site near a major Iranian naval hub that had reportedly been targeting American aircraft flying overhead. A military spokesperson framed it simply: the strikes were carried out to protect American troops from an active threat, a notably calm way to describe things in the middle of a shooting conflict. Iranian state media, true to the pattern by now, claimed an American drone had been shot down and that air defenses had also fired on other aircraft. The American military didn't comment on those specific claims, which by this point should tell you something about how these two sides tend to describe the exact same event. That particular target, the air defense site near the naval hub, deserves a moment of its own, because it wasn't just another coastal battery. That location has functioned for years as one of the most important operational centers for Iran's naval forces, meaning an air defense system stationed there wasn't purely there to protect the coastline. It was fully capable of threatening American surveillance and strike aircraft flying over the strait and its approaches. Striking it on the same day as the mine-laying boats tells you the self-defense justification being used throughout this stretch wasn't limited to responding only after a weapon had already been fired. It extended to knocking out systems seen as an ongoing threat before they had the chance to be used. Before we wrap this up, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about getting the real picture instead of just a scary headline, so do me one favor, share this with someone who's only seen the surface level version of this story, because the full pattern matters more than any single headline ever could. What's not really in dispute, no matter which side of that debate you land on, is just how often this exact cycle repeated itself. Small boats destroyed after Iran targeted commercial and military ships together. A coordinated 3-ship attack answered with 0 hits and immediate retaliation. Tankers disabled for violating the blockade. Mine-laying boats and an air defense site struck weeks later in what the military again called self-defense. 4 separate confirmed engagements in roughly 3 weeks, all happening underneath a ceasefire that, on paper, was supposed to have ended major fighting back in mid-April. That gap between what the documents say and what the water actually looked like week after week is really the heart of this entire story, and it's a gap that stretched on for weeks, even as negotiators kept working toward extending the very ceasefire being tested almost every few days on the water. Whatever conclusion you draw from all of this, one thing is hard to argue with. This war has repeatedly proven that a signed ceasefire and a calm sea are not the same thing, and the crews on those destroyers know that better than anyone watching from thousands of miles away ever could. So here's where all of this leaves us. On May 7, 2026, Iran launched a fully coordinated missile, drone, and small boat attack against 3 American destroyers moving through one of the most dangerous, narrowest waterways on the planet, during a ceasefire both nations had already agreed to just weeks earlier. Every single part of that attack failed. Not one American sailor was hurt, not one American ship was touched. And within hours, the response reached deep into the network that made the attack possible in the first place. That single afternoon could have gone so differently. One missile getting through, even a glancing hit that did nothing close to sinking a ship, would have marked the first direct Iranian strike on an American warship in this entire war, and it almost certainly would have triggered a response far bigger than the one that actually happened. The fact that this ended in 0 hits instead of becoming the spark for something much larger isn't a small footnote buried in this story. It might be the single biggest reason this stayed one dangerous afternoon among several, instead of the moment 2 nations already at war tipped into something neither side could easily pull back from. It's worth sitting with just how strange this entire dynamic really is once you step back from it. A ceasefire was signed. Both governments called it a step toward peace. And yet, in the weeks that followed, missiles were fired, tankers were disabled, boats were sunk, and warships dodged coordinated attacks in broad daylight, all while both sides kept insisting they were simply defending themselves. That's not hypocrisy exactly. It's closer to how modern conflicts actually end, slowly, messily, with plenty of violence still happening underneath the paperwork before anything close to real peace takes hold. Think about the 2 very different versions of this story that were being written at the exact same moment. In Washington, and in whatever quiet room negotiators were using to hash out the terms of a longer ceasefire, this looked like diplomacy slowly, painfully grinding forward. Out on the water, 3 warships were dodging missiles fired by an enemy that had signed onto the exact same peace terms less than a month earlier. Both of those stories were true at the same time, and neither side seemed particularly bothered by how strange that contradiction actually was. Whatever happens next in these negotiations, the water beneath the Strait of Hormuz has already shown, again and again, exactly how fast a signed ceasefire can turn into live combat in the space of a single transit, and exactly how completely American naval forces have answered every single time that line got tested. Whether that pattern holds the next time Iran decides to test it, or whether one of these engagements eventually goes the other way, is the question everyone from Washington to Tehran is quietly trying to answer right now. If this walked you through the full picture instead of just the headline, you already know what to do. Like it, subscribe, and share it, because the next time this line gets tested, you'll want to already understand exactly what's at stake.